afternoon, everybody, and welcome. For those who are joining us for the first time, my name is Jessica Blumenthal, and I'm a director in the Banking and Finance Department at ENS Africa. For the last 3 years, the Banking and Finance Department have presented the CPD series for those in the financial services sector who are required to undertake continuous professional development. And for the last 2 years, we've used this opportunity to canvass topics which we believe are of importance to this industry under the banner of ESG. Those who joined us last year will know that we presented topics which were largely introductory, as we used our platform to raise awareness of emerging risks and opportunities. And this year, we've decided to use the opportunity to delve a bit deeper, bringing together panels of experts to present masterclasses in what we think are some of the most pressing issues in the financial sector and, in fact, all sectors today. Last week, our presenters spoke about changing regulatory trends in the advice industry. We heard from experts in the crypto space and what's happening there. And we heard about the risks posed to investment portfolios in respect of water scarcity and unavailability. This is the 4th episode or installment, and I'm very happy today to be welcoming our Chief Operating Officer, Otsile Matlau, and the head of our Natural Resources and Environment Department, Nsiki Adonisi Kagama. Both Nsiki and Otsile are well-known mining lawyers, but they're also members of ENS Africa's ESG practice group. The ESG practice group is a multidisciplinary, multi-jurisdictional group of practitioners from all our multiple practice areas and sitting in our offices throughout Africa. The diverse perspective of this group allows us to consider ESG and sustainability-related issues holistically, ensuring that we can offer innovative solutions and strategic guidance founded in local knowledge and experience. Our topic today tackles a difficult and often polarizing issue. In the race to a post-carbon economy, we must ensure that the transition, which is bound to be messy, given the pace at which we have to move, we must ensure that that transition is just. We must also consider the differing context between the global south and the global north, and we must ensure that future prosperity is shared. So I'm really thankful to Otsile and Nsiki for sharing their thoughts with us on this important topic today. Before I hand over to Otsile to kick us off, just a few housekeeping points. You have had the opportunity to send in your questions. Thank you to those who have done so. And just a reminder that if you do have questions whilst you're listening to our panelists, you are able to add them in the Q&A block, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat block. If you add questions in the chat, we're not able to get back to you. But if you add them in the Q&A block and we don't have time to deal with them, then we will get back to you separately after this presentation. If you are one of the participants joining us for a CPD certificate, then please remember that you do need to stay on for the duration of the presentation so that we can verify your attendance and therefore give you your certificate. We unfortunately cannot give certificates to those who were not on for the full duration of the presentation, and so please do just bear that in mind. And without any further, anything further from me, I'm going to hand over now to Otsile, who will then hand over to Nsiki, and then I'll be back at the end. Thank you. Thanks, Otsile.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and good afternoon to everyone. Let me also join in and welcome everyone. Hope that you will enjoy this conversation with us. It's a topic very difficult, like Jessica says, but one that's quite important in the world that we live in today, to grapple with the difficult issues of what investors need to think about in considering investments in the energy space, given the very difficult issues that we face between a very binary context of energy security and energy transition. So it's quite a challenging topic and therefore presents thought-provoking issues to investors. We will try and navigate through the issues and highlight as much as we think can be covered in the space that we have. We will try very hard not to make this a legal discussion. It's just transition is not a legal topic at all. It has legal connotations, but it's a macroeconomic and political economy issue that touches, I think, all aspects of human life. So we'll try and keep it at the right level. The presentation that I want to take you through covers 4 aspects. And we'll go through each of the 4 aspects with an introduction, just a couple of contextual stuff and what just transition means, and then touch on the Great Divide that Jessica spoke about, the global North and the global South. The divide is quite a fluid one, because on some issues you can go East and West, and on some issues you can go North and South. And on a number of issues, in fact, role players swap positions. We'd also want to then touch on the just transition itself, particularly in the context of so-called dirty industries, and unpack some of the political economy issues that arise out of that. And then close off with some dash of a conversation around some of the regulatory issues, some of the risks and the opportunities that investors need to keep in mind. I should apologize upfront and say, although we've got a deck of slides, I don't propose going through the slides. So the slide that you currently see is the very last one that you will see. And what I do in fact propose is going back to dealing with each of the topics and hopefully capturing and dealing with some of the interesting aspects of each. And then I'll hand over to Nziki. So let's get straight into it. I think the first thing that one needs to remember as a context is this topic happens in a world where we are grappling with climate change. We are grappling with the reality that the globe is warming at an alarming rate. And there's a number of people on either side of the spectrum, those who believe that we can in fact slow global warming and try and manage some of its adverse impacts, and some who think the exact opposite, that the globe is robust and has lived through centuries and generations and doesn't need us to help it do anything. It'll self-regulate. We don't want to go into that scientific conversation. Suffice to say, we hinge our conversation on the fact that the climate change has brought adverse weather conditions, certainly to our part of the world. We've seen very disturbing changes in the weather patterns, and so we come at it from that point of view. And so the starting point really is to understand this lovely phrase, just transition, or as people in the energy space would like to call it, just energy transition, because there's a small difference between just transition and just energy transition. And the difference lies in the fact that just transition is a much broader concept, of which the energy component is a smaller one. We'll talk about just transition more broadly and then weave the energy issues as they arise. And so like good lawyers do, the first point to start with is some definitions. And the definitions I'm going to give you are my own definitions. I'm not going to give you definitions based on any scholarly article or any presentation by a doyen of anything. And these are definitions that I believe best capture the dynamic nature of what just transition is all about. The first one is just. The word just carries with it a whole host of meanings and connotations, both in law and in sociology. In our context, it speaks to the notion that whatever we do must involve considerations of the totality of the economic, social, environmental, and global political issues that arise in the context of what we're talking about, being the energy industry at the moment. And so the idea is that one has to embed local nuance, local context into whatever the assessment and the issues are that investors preoccupy their minds with when they look at investment decisions. And so the notion that you can have a global investment framework that you use to invest wherever investment opportunities arise doesn't always sit very well with the concept of justness. And so these global investment frameworks need to have a nuance for regional context and local nuance. And so this notion of justness speaks, therefore, to what we must all consider in the context of the specific company or country or location or region that one is operating in. The second concept is that of a transition. And by its nature, if you go back to its Latin roots of the Latin root of the word transition, which is transire, if you go all the way back there, it speaks to the notion of movement from one to another, a process of transformation of something from its former self to what it needs to become. And in the context of the energy issues that we're talking about, the transition really that we're talking about is a transition away from a carbon-inspired energy generation to a post-carbon energy generation world. And whether the transition is a sprint or a marathon requires you to bring the concept of justness into it. It may very well be just in one context to sprint. In another context, it might be just to jog your way through a nice 42-kilometer marathon and make sure you manage your splits. And so the concept of just transition therefore means in each context, taking into account the totality of the issues that are at play from a social, from an economic, from an environmental, from a political, and really from all aspects, to ensure that the transition from the one way of generation of energy to another is relevant to the environment in which you're considering it. And to localize that to the context of South Africa. Our starting point in South Africa is our base load is coal. So we generate most of our power from coal. And that is so for a whole host of historical reasons, including an abundance of coal resources in South Africa. But that's what our base load is. Forget for a moment that we have an unstable grid and we have this lovely thing called load shedding in South Africa at the moment. But if you simply look at our base load, we are a coal-fired base load economy. And we need to move our energy mix into alternative sources of energy. And the question that then arises in South Africa's context, is it just to invest significant amounts into renewable energies, into alternative sources of energy, or is it just in the context of South Africa to invest heavily in the coal sector to hopefully help the grid to stabilize and to provide basic electricity to households? Now, depending on where you are in the debate, some people think it's an extremely stupid thing to spend money and invest it in assets of yesterday, being the coal-fired power stations. You should rather spend exactly the same amount in much cleaner sources of energy. And so in the context of South Africa, an opportunity arises because of the energy crisis to consider whether the justness of the decisions that are taken weigh more in favor of a rapid transition to cleaner energy sources, or whether in fact one needs to look at the base load and do what you can to make sure the base load is stable, it's good, it's able to provide the needs of the country. Now, of course, when you look at that, you have to look at the reality that the way the South African economy is currently set up means that the coal industry is a significant employer of people of all skills level, from really unskilled labor to the most technical and sophisticated of skills. And if you turn your back on that industry in favor of energy generation in another industry, you may then in fact create issues in the labor market. And in a country that has an unemployment rate that's already out of control, that may in fact be unjust. So those are the issues that you need to consider. On the other hand, it would potentially also be unjust to forget about clean energy, because in the context of South Africa, we do have an opportunity presented by the energy crisis to move with technology and with speed to much cleaner sources of energy, because there's scarcity of capital and you do need to decide where to deploy it. And whether you deploy capital in dirty assets or in clean assets is a very difficult investment decision. Now, of course, in the context of South Africa, the banks have over time, and I must say rather slowly as opposed to banks elsewhere in the world, have over time taken the stance against coal investment. And so our banks have traveled some distance in that direction. And so capital that's available through lending in South Africa already has this reality around it. On the other hand, because of what's happening in the world at the moment, coal is not so unpopular. And in fact, in the last 3 years, the price of coal moved from really nowhere and shot right up. And those of you who are familiar with KZN and the Richards Bay area will know of the Richards Bay coal terminal. If you drive anywhere near the terminal these days, there's a long, long queue of trucks waiting to take coal into the terminal for export markets. If you told me that this would be the case 4 years ago and that a lot of that coal would be headed to Europe, I would have said you're smoking something. But the reality today is that's what's happening. And why has that happened? Two things. One of which is mostly spoken about, but there's quite another that's not recognized. The first one is the war in Ukraine has undermined sources of energy supply in Europe. And as a result, there's been European, not exclusively European, but let me say Northern Hemisphere demand for coal. So that's the well-known reason for that. But there is another, and that's that in the post-COVID pandemic world, we saw a rapid recovery of major economies. And when those economies were recovering, demand of all sorts of supplies and products put a strain on energy generation resources. And as a result, dirty assets like coal became alternatives that people started looking at quite seriously. And so the just energy transition is all about an understanding of the interplay between security of supply and energy change and the transition away from fossil fuel to a post-carbon economy. So that's what the interplay is about. And let me say a couple of things about this binary world where just energy transition plays itself. We live in a very binary world today. On the one hand, you've got the needs and the demands of the developed world. On the other, you've got the needs and the demands of the developing world. That's the first sort of tension that you run into. The second one that you run into is the issues that arise even intra-country, inside a geopolitical space, where you've got interest groups that are pro-fossil fuels, that say industrial revolution, all the way to modern development and the industrialization of the developing nations cannot happen unless fossil fuels are at the heart of what we do. And those proponents usually have got allies in the mining industry, even in non-energy minerals, because they have a common cause, and that common cause is around the notion that mining remains at the heart of the global economy. There's a famous saying amongst miners that if you can't grow it, then you must mine it. And the suggestion there are two things that are at the heart of the basic resources that every economy needs: the things that we grow and the things that we mine. And they even go so far as to say, even the renewable energy plants, farms, turbines, everything that you do, none of them happen unless you're mining, because all of them use significant mineral resources in order to happen. So the pro-fossil fuel crowd have an alliance just broadly within the extractive industries. On the other hand, you have people who say, time is running out. We need to take global warming seriously. What we saw in the last 8 weeks coming out of the Mozambique Channel into Mozambique, into Malawi, into Zimbabwe, and into the northern parts of South Africa, and all the way into Botswana, and ultimately into the Atlantic Ocean through Namibia, was a devastating storm. And those things happen more and more. And the reality of the situation for us who live in the global south is that we experience more of the adverse climate changes, even though our contribution to global warming are minuscule in comparison to the global north. And so those guys are saying, time is running out. We need to act now. And so in this binary world, both investors and regulators have to take very difficult decisions. And essentially, they need to balance security of supply as well as contributing towards the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050. So that's what they need to do. And what makes it complicated is most proponents of climate change and all the interventions that come from that part of thinking or school of thought happen to come from developed nations. And most of the rules, including the regulatory frameworks that we see that are out there and that are more advanced, tend to come from there too. And then you have the skeptics and the cynics who say, well, take the Brits, for example. They developed their economy through massive coal fields and Blackpool and other parts of the UK. And now that the economy has been successfully converted away from an industrial economy to a services and a financial services economy, they have now labeled the very assets that enable them to develop as dirty. And they are saying to the global south, follow us on this quest and leave coal in the ground. There are things that you can do that are better. And then people in the global south saying, hang on a minute, we too need to industrialize. We've got unemployment that's at significant rates and all of that. Our economies need supply, and we are set up for a generation through fossil fuel. So when you're sitting in an investment committee of a company or of a lender, and you're thinking about what does this all mean to us, unfortunately, political preferences won't help you. You in fact do need to take into account sometimes conflicting considerations. Our own Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy in South Africa is on record as saying that we are going to ban our coal and it will be the backbone of our economy and it will be the backbone of our generation. We are not going to walk away from it. At the same time, the ministry that he presides over and government are publishing quite seminal pieces around the transition away from the fossil fuels into a post-carbon economy. We've got a framework that deals with that. We've got legislation, both actual and also still in the process, trying to reposition South Africa away from this. And all that goes to show just how difficult this binary world that we find ourselves is. And the point I want to buttress is that what is just from an energy transition point of view is a function of where you are, first and foremost. Secondly, it is a function of the world that you want to design and that you want to leave for future generations. And those things are not alternatives, they are cumulative. So you must start by looking at where you are. What are the challenges where we find ourselves today, and how do we respond to them? All the social challenges, lack of social cohesion, all the employment issues, all the macroeconomic issues that a country is facing, the reality of the country's environmental management issues. Some countries are sitting in a far better place from an environmental management than others. So you've got to look after those. And once you're clear about what those issues are, you also have to imagine the world that you will live for tomorrow. Because taking decisions like the industrialists of the 1800s did, of simply looking at industrial development as a spur for economic development and ignoring consequences of industrialization, you simply can't do it today. It's too expensive a mistake to make. And so you do need to look at the architecture of tomorrow's world whilst addressing today's needs. How one does that is a very difficult thing. And to my mind, it requires level-headedness away from political slogans, away from ideology, and away from position play. And it requires leadership around making sure that you take the country where you are and you move along with it. My own view is that in the context of South Africa, if South Africa simply dumped coal as part of the energy mix and invested every rand that we have in cleaner energies, that would result to social strife, that would result to instability. I mean, I already think that we are teetering on problems with joblessness. And so, to my mind, you've got to still keep what we have. And however weak our grid is at the moment, that's what we have. And a key consideration about migration to cleaner energy is whether we have sufficient energy today to even build resources to enable us to get to that world of clean energy. And so it's quite a difficult thing to deal with. And so what are the issues that I would think investors need to worry about? And what are some of the critical thoughts around what investors need to do at the political level and at an economic level? The first one is there is no society that can thrive, absolutely no society that can thrive, unless the poorest in that society are invested in the stability of that country. Where the poor have nothing to lose, economic development is impossible. So they need to be invested in a future of that country. That means the economy must be able to provide for basic needs. I don't think there's an economy in the world that can provide for every single human being. I'd like to live in that world, but I think the global economic structure simply makes it impossible. And even the philanthropic ideological systems that have been tried, like communism and socialism, even those with stated objectives of getting there, were incapable of getting there. But an economy needs to cater for the less fortunate. When they are invested in its stability, then you can see economic growth. That means people must have jobs, children must go to school, basic services must work, there must be universal access to basic electricity and similar services. Once you have those things, you've got a chance for economic growth. Where you are in a country like South Africa, where you've got massive unemployment and you've got the extractive industries, the mining industry, including the coal industry, reducing and shedding jobs all the time is supposed to increase in them. And then you have an unmanaged transition away from coal into renewables. That will lead to instability, in my view. And the sweet spot, and therefore a key consideration for investors, is how do you make sure that your investment rents, as opposed to your operating rents that you put into the energy sector to generate, your investment rent goes to the transition, but your operating rents, in fact, go towards the maintenance of what we currently have. And maybe a good example to illustrate this point is, if you think about, let's talk about one power station, Medupi power station. If you think about a typical power station and you think about the air quality issues that arise there, and the compliance with air quality legislation that Eskom needs to worry about. If you run Medupi and you are not generating at capacity because you've got breakdowns, you've got challenges, and so you put money into those. And at the same time, you need to think, do I also need to put money into the reduction of emissions? In other words, improving air quality, or is this money better spent developing hydro energy, developing solar energy, developing wind energy? So when you are in that world and you are thinking about things that way, it's quite difficult to take your investment money and put it into air quality whilst the grid is unstable. So you want to take money and make sure the grid is stable. When the grid is stable, you actually don't want to develop the capacity of Medupi to generate more. You want to take your investment money into clean energy. And so those are some of the challenges that you find yourself with from an investment point of view. And those are the things that I think investors need to worry about. Then the other set of considerations, to my mind, that the investors need to worry about, and maybe not only investors, I think investors and political leaders need to worry about, are issues around the sustainability of the renewable energy sources themselves and the sufficiency of those, and to make sure that you get your balance right. There are some countries that simply don't rely on fossil fuels anymore. But those countries are few and far between. If you look at the large economies around the world, they rely for their backbone on fossil fuels, and they are moving away from them, and they should. And so the question that investors must grapple with is, how do we chart the path that makes sense for each of the regions in each of the countries? And to my mind, it's a conversation between regulators, the political leadership, as well as the investment community. And if you do it in a pact, I'm suggesting that you will find much better ways of harmonizing these binary issues and making sure the transition is purpose-built for the market or the jurisdiction where you operate. In all of this, the one thing we can never forget is the environment itself, because it will survive all of us. We are here on a transitional basis, but our footprint may have a long-term effect. And so the notion which finds inspiration in sustainable development, that we must make sure that we look after the globe, not only for current, but future generations, and joins us to have much more political will to move with bravado and with decision-making that is precise towards the renewable and cleaner space. Let me then touch on one issue which just shows how dynamic the conversation that we're having is. And that is, what do you do when you find yourself in the situation that Europe finds itself in today? You take decisions, you go to Paris, you come out with various decisive, progressive undertakings. You go to Glasgow, you fortify, you do all of that work. Having done that work, you run into a war situation. And that war undermines your very good stated objectives. And you end up being in a world where you need dirty energy. And in your world at that time, the choice between tomorrow and today is a very difficult one, because today is upon you, and today has demands that if you don't address successfully, you don't even have a chance of a controlled and better tomorrow. And so in that environment, you may be seen to be reneging and going back on your policy decisions. And for the skeptics, they go one point further and say, in that world, you then go to the very developing nations that are struggling for these resources for themselves, and you take those resources and appropriate them for yourself using the age-old market rule of supply and demand. My view is that the dynamism that's happening at the moment with the surge in the prices of oil and gas and coal just serves as a reminder that just transition is not a linear path. It's a very dynamic path. It's a path that must be at all times balancing impossible things. How do you make sure that you have warm households in the global north? How do you make sure that the financial systems in the global north function in times of war? At the same time, being true to the quest of transitioning the world away from fossil fuels to a post-carbon globe. And so what that shows is just how dynamic and difficult these issues are. And to my mind, as I said, it's not a linear conversation. It's not teleological at all. It doesn't move from A to Z. It should broadly move in the direction towards Z and away from A. But that movement must be inspired by the realities that you find yourself in. And against this, what interventions do regulators bring and what are the risks and opportunities that we see in this space of the energy industries. The regulators tend to come late. That's the function of regulation. You tend to regulate when something has happened that requires you to regulate. That's the reality of regulation. The second thing is, even when you regulate late, you are subject to influence by interest groups. Some regulators take more of the pressure from the extractive industries, and so they are slower in regulation. Some take the influence from the proponents of the post-carbon economy, and therefore they are quicker to regulate. And which one a country finds itself in is a function of political will at the end of the day. And in South Africa at the moment, if one thinks about the totality of laws around ESG as it impacts the energy sector, in other words, employment laws that may be relevant, company laws, finance laws, environmental extractive laws, laws that deal with health and safety, explosives. If you look at the totality of the suite of legislation, the South African regulatory framework is more geared towards sustainable development than transition to a cleaner economy. At the moment, that's where the balance seems to be. But newer legislation, recent trends are starting to show a much more direct move towards balancing the scale towards the transition. And in my view, are still skewed against the transition, simply because of the fact that the South African economy has developed over many years. And for most of that development, the energy, the approach to the regulation of the energy environment had absolutely nothing to do with global warming. But there's a clear transition away towards a more favorable climate and environment. So that's where the regulatory environment finds itself in. My last thought is around risk and opportunities. There was a time as a mining lawyer where it was very easy to fund coal transactions. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen those things happen. That time has come and that time is gone. Certainly not through traditional means of finance. What's interesting, and one can look at a public example of Seriti Coal. Now there is an entity that became a beneficiary of coal assets because South 32 and Anglo Coal were offloading coal assets. And if you look at the transactions they've done, and they're public transactions, so not subject to any confidentialities, you end up doing a massive transaction where you're effectively selling debt. The old guy saying, if you buy my debt and you release me from it, you can have these assets. And you raise capital in order to do that. And within 2 or 3 years, the entity has become extremely profitable. Not because they planned it to be like that, but because of supply and demand. And so the point I want to make is there are economic opportunities in dirty assets, even today. And those economic opportunities in some jurisdictions are completely dependent on the political economy of the time. In some jurisdictions, in fact, are necessary in order to spur the economy to the next level. On the risk side, particularly for directors of companies, the evolution of company laws, and particular of fiduciary responsibilities, have placed much more emphasis and weight on the shoulders of the individual director. If you sit on a board and it takes decisions that impact the environment, you had better speak up, which means directors need master classes on how to deal with discharging their fiduciary duties in the context of this transition away from dirty to clean energy. Because individual liability of directors, which is not a new thing in company law, but it's something that is taken much more seriously around the world with convictions happening. It's something that execs need to think about and worry about seriously. Investors need to worry about the character of their finding and of the profile of their finance and on whether they will be seen as people that invest in the right type of assets that enable their products and portfolios to be attractive. All of those issues are things that investors need to look at. And from our point of view, as lawyers who advise in this space, the task for advising has become much more difficult because it's no longer around the do's and the don'ts of the law. It's also around social equities and how do you place your clients in a position where their decisions, their investments are not only good financially, but they're actually good for the environment in which they operate. So those are the things that I wanted to share, and I'm now going to hand over to Ntsiki. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rudzile. Mine is to just sum up what we've been discussing this afternoon, which is just transition means different things in different jurisdictions, taking into account their different priorities and resources. And as Uzile said, when you look at justness, you need to look at it in the totality of issues, which include political, economic, and social elements. So just transition is about moving to a low carbon economy while ensuring that livelihoods are protected and no one is left behind. What may be just in the US may not necessarily be in Kenya, for instance. So if you have two different things that may be just, but in different jurisdictions. It may be just in the UK, for instance, to use coal because they don't have an alternative, but that coal that they use still impacts on the environment. So when we look at transition, the speed of transition depends on the context of each jurisdiction. So highly industrialized jurisdictions with high rates of employment and services economy can move quicker than jurisdictions which have skilled labor, because in that jurisdiction, a very quick transition will lead to more unemployment, and that would be unjust. So post-carbon economy sentiments must be balanced with the aspirations of developing nations, because developing nations have more challenging socioeconomic issues. So the South African energy crisis presents an opportunity of fast-tracking certain aspects of the renewable energy. And the investment approach should have regional nuance, because what you can do, for instance, in Finland may not work for South Africa. So investors are required to be more nimble and contextual. Investor sentiments also highlights that companies that do not adapt to a decarbonized economy are likely to be left behind, while those that embrace the change will see greater opportunities. So it's essential to note that financing is available to those companies that effectively integrate the ESG into their business strategies and operations as part of a just transition. The dirty assets are a misnomer. As we know, when you look at the coal prices, the coal was bought by the jurisdictions that label it as dirty. So we just need to be careful on which jurisdiction we're looking at. And as Utsile mentioned, if you cannot grow it, you must mine it. And mining is a fundamental pillar of modern economy. We must mine in a cleaner and sustainable manner. And in South Africa, for instance, we have very progressive environmental laws, which will support this. And it is also predicted that there will be a significant demand of the clean technology minerals, the metals of the future. So just to close off, as the NRE team, we are here tasked to guide our clients through the regulatory ESG maze in the continent, both in the extractives and the environment conservation industries. Thank you for your participation, and I will now hand over to Jessica.
Thanks very much, Nsiki. Thank you to both you and Otsile for that very fascinating discussion. And as you both said in your presentations, dealing with difficult topics, dealing with binary conflicting positions, and trying to weigh all of that against each other. I think some of the points that you've made around how important context is to any decision being made and to any strategic decision being made around transition is important. That context is critical in that decision-making process. And I think the points that Otsile made about the importance of leadership and brave leadership at that to help us through these difficult times towards the future that I think we all accept we need to transition toward. Very helpful comments as well. So thank you to both of you for joining us as part of the CPD series. And for those who've enjoyed this series, please do remember we still have several more installments left in the series. We will be hearing tomorrow from some of our other colleagues who will be talking about the rise of climate litigation and picking up actually on that point that Otsile made around the potential liability for directors trying to act in accordance with fiduciary duties. The team tomorrow, or the panelists tomorrow, will be talking about that, risks for directors and also risks of litigation and defensive steps to take to protect against the risk of litigation. So that will be tomorrow's installment. And next week you will hear from, there are 2 sessions next week because of the short week. You will hear from our procurement team talking about what you need to know from a governance perspective when contracting with a state, either a state-owned entity or otherwise a government department, what the governance checks are that you need to do. They'll be unpacking that and talking through that. And we will also have a session next week for pension funds and service providers to pension funds, talking about emerging risks in that context and what pension fund trustees need to be aware of. Obviously, pension fund trustees similarly having a fiduciary duty the same way that directors do, and arguably a greater duty given the requirements of Regulation 28, requiring pension fund trustees to consider environmental, social, and governance factors and to take a long-term view when investing assets. So those are the sessions coming up, and we hope that some of you or all of you will be able to join us for those sessions. The sessions are recorded, so if you've missed any of the ones that we've already presented and which I mentioned in my introduction when we started this panel discussion, you can access those on our website. So if you go to the website, you'll be able to access those. They're also on our YouTube channel if you prefer to access them through that platform. And I think that that's all I have to share with you today. Thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.